You know, they say that courage is a great quality, but sometimes it turns into madness, akin to trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Paraguay, a small country in the heart of South America with big ambitions, decided in the mid-19th century that it could stand up to three large neighboring countries at once. Why did the country's leader believe so strongly in the strength of his army, his people, and in his righteousness, as well as in his military genius? This is a story not only about battles, but also about the people who got caught up in a conflict where the stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. Why did Paraguay decide to wager more than it could afford? And how did everything turn out in a way that no one expected? It's about how we got one of the most illustrative and truly dramatic events in history, the Paraguayan War against the Triple Alliance. The roots of the war actually began under the previous ruler of Paraguay, namely Francia Lopez, who, according to some opinions, remains one of the most important figures in Paraguayan history. One can talk endlessly about the Lopez dynasty, but in the context of this event, our interest lies in Francia. Francia conducted secularization, that is, confiscation of church and monastic property and lands, and ruthlessly eliminated criminal gangs, so that within a few years, people forgot about crime. Paraguay developed a unique national economy based on communal labor and small private entrepreneurship. Moreover, such remarkable phenomena emerged in the country. Bearing in mind that this was the first half of the 19th century, as free education, free healthcare, low taxes, and public food funds. As a result, in Paraguay, especially given its rather isolated position relative to global economic centers, a strong state-run industry was created. This allowed it to be an economically independent state. By the mid-19th century, Paraguay had become the fastest-growing and most prosperous state in Latin America. It is worth noting that it was a unique state where poverty did not exist as a phenomenon, although there were plenty of rich people in Paraguay. But it is important to note that the wealthy class was quite peacefully integrated into society. After the death of Francia, which was a tragedy for the entire nation, his nephew, Carlos Antonio Lopez, took over the country by the decision of Congress, ruling alongside Consul Mariano Roque Alonso until 1844. He was a similarly tough and consistent leader. He introduced a series of liberal reforms. The country was ready for opening up. In 1845, access to Paraguay was open to foreigners. And in 1846, the old protective customs tariff was replaced with a more liberal one, and the port of Pilar on the Paraná River was opened for foreign trade. Lopez reorganized the army to European standards, increasing its size from 5,000 to 8,000 men. Several fortresses were built, and a river fleet was created. The country endured a 7-year war with Argentina, and eventually, the Argentinians were forced to recognize Paraguay's independence. Work continued on the development of education. Scientific societies were opened, transportation routes and navigation were improved, and shipbuilding was advanced. Overall, the country maintained its identity, with nearly all the land in Paraguay belonging to the state. In 1862, Lopez died, leaving the country to his son, Francisco Solano Lopez. A new national Congress ratified his authority for 10 years. During this time, the country reached the peak of its development. Its population reached 1.3 million people, and there was no national debt since the country had not taken any foreign loans. At the beginning of the rule of the second Lopez, the first railway was built, stretching 72 kilometers. Paraguay invited over 200 foreign specialists who laid telegraph lines and railroads. This helped develop the steel, textile, paper, and printing industries, as well as gunpowder production and shipbuilding. Paraguay created its own defense industry, manufacturing not only gunpowder and other ammunition, but also cannons and mortars, and building ships in the shipyards of Asunción. Paraguay was, in every sense, the heart of South America. Of course, not everyone was pleased with this. As such, Paraguay, quite logically, sought to strengthen its influence in the region and secure access to the sea for trade development. However, its ambitions met resistance from neighboring countries, especially Brazil and Argentina, who did not want Paraguay to grow stronger. Neighboring Uruguay was looking to Paraguay's successful experience, and after them, the experiment might triumph across the continent. A potential alliance between Paraguay and Uruguay challenged the interests of Great Britain and the Argentina and Brazil. Naturally, this caused dissatisfaction and concern among the British and Latin American ruling clans. Additionally, Paraguay had territorial disputes with Argentina. A pretext for war was needed, and it was quickly found. In the spring of 1864, the Brazilians sent a diplomatic mission to Uruguay and demanded compensation for damages caused to Brazilian farmers in border conflicts with Uruguayan farmers. The head of Uruguay, Atanasio Aguirre, from the National Party, which supported an alliance with Paraguay, rejected the Brazilian demands. The Paraguayan leader offered himself as a mediator in the negotiations between Brazil and Uruguay, but Rio de Janeiro opposed this proposal. In August 1864, the Paraguayan government severed diplomatic relations with Brazil and declared that Brazilian intervention and occupation of Uruguay would disrupt the regional balance. In October, Brazilian troops invaded Uruguay. Supporters of the Colorado Party, a pro-Brazilian party in Uruguay, supported by Argentina, allied with the Brazilians and overthrew the Aguirre government. Uruguay was a strategically important partner for Paraguay, as nearly all Paraguayan trade passed through its capital, Montevideo. However, the Brazilians occupied this port. Paraguay was forced into war, mobilizing the army to reach 38,000 troops, which, with a reserve of 60,000, effectively constituted a people's militia. On December 13, 1864, the Paraguayan government declared war on Brazil, and on March 18, 1865, on Argentina. Uruguay, already under the leadership of the pro-Brazilian politician Venancio Flores, joined the alliance with Brazil and Argentina. On May 1, 1865, in the Argentine capital, 3 countries signed the Treaty of the Triple Alliance. The international community, led by Great Britain, supported the Triple Alliance. The enlightened Europeans provided substantial assistance to the alliance with ammunition, weapons, military advisors, and loans for the war. At the initial stage, the Paraguayan army was more powerful, both in numbers, with the Argentinians having about 8,500 men at the start of the war, the Brazilians 16,000, and the Uruguayans 2,000 balers, and in terms of motivation and organization. Moreover, it was well armed, with the Paraguayan army having up to 400 artillery pieces. The backbone of the Triple Alliance's military forces consisted of Brazilian armed units, mainly composed of detachments from local politicians and some parts of the National Guard, which often included slaves who were promised freedom. Subsequently, various volunteers and adventurers from across the continent joined the coalition, eager to participate in plundering a wealthy country. It was believed that the war would be short, as Paraguay was significantly outmatched by the Triple Alliance in terms of population, economic strength, and the support of the international community. The war was effectively financed by loans from the London Bank and banking houses such as the Baring Brothers and Rothschild and Sons. However, they had to fight against an armed populace and militias. In the initial stages, the Paraguayan army achieved several victories. To the north, they captured the Brazilian fort of Nova Coimbra, and in January 1865, they took the towns of Albuquerque and Corumba. In the south, Paraguayan forces were successful in the southern part of the state of Mato Grosso, In March 1865, the Paraguayan government requested permission from Argentine President Bartolomé Mitre to allow a 25,000-strong army to pass through the province of Corrientes for an invasion of the Brazilian province of Rio Grande do Sul. However, Buenos Aires refused, and on March 18, 1865, Paraguay declared war on Argentina. The Paraguayan fleet, at the outset of the war, consisting of 23 small steamers and several minor vessels, with the gunboat Tacuary as the flagship, descended the Paraná River, blockaded the port of Corrientes, and then captured it with ground forces. At the same time, Paraguayan forces crossed the Argentine border and struck through Argentine territory into the Brazilian province of Rio Grande do Sul. On June 12, 1865, they captured the city of São Borja, and on August 5th, they took Uruguayana. By early 1868, Brazilian Argentine-Uruguayan troops approached the Paraguayan capital city of Asunción. However, capturing the city without naval support was impossible, even though it could be accessed by sea via the Paraguay River. Nonetheless, the fortress of Humaitá blocked this path. The Allies had been besieging it for over a year, but had not succeeded in capturing it. The most challenging aspect was the river's horseshoe-shaped bend at this location, lined with coastal batteries. As a result, ships heading to Asunción had to traverse several kilometers under crossfire at close range, an insurmountable task for wooden vessels. By 1866-1867, the Brazilians had acquired the first river ironclads in Latin America, floating batteries of the Barroso type, and turret monitors like the Pará. The monitors were constructed at a state shipyard in Rio de Janeiro and became the first turret ironclads in Latin America, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere. It was decided that the Brazilian ironclad squadron would proceed up the Paraguay River to the fortress of Humaitá and destroy it with their fire. The squadron included the small monitors, Pará, Alagoas, and Rio Grande, the slightly larger monitor, Bahia, and the casemate river ironclads, Barroso and Tamandaré. Interestingly, the Bahia was initially named Minerva and was being built in England for Paraguay, ironically. However, during the war, Paraguay was blockaded, the deal was cancelled, and to the delight of the British, the ship was acquired by Brazil. At that time, Humaitá was Paraguay's strongest fortress. Construction began in 1844 and continued for nearly 15 years. Humaitá was equipped with 120 artillery pieces, 80 of which covered the channel, while the remainder defended the fortress from land. Many batteries were positioned in brick casemates with wall thicknesses of 1.5 meters or 1.64 ft or more, while some guns were protected by earthen embankments. The most powerful battery at the Humaitá fortress was the casemate battery, Londres, armed with 16 32-pounder guns under the command of an English mercenary, Major Hadley Tuttle. However, it is worth noting that the quantity of guns did not match their quality. There were very few rifled guns among them. The majority were old cannons firing solid shot, which posed no threat to armored vessels. To prevent the Brazilian ships from entering the river, the highly resourceful Paraguayans stretched 3 thick iron chains across the river, secured on pontoons. Their plan was that these chains would stop the enemy right in the battery's range, where every meter of the river's surface was precisely targeted. As for the Brazilians, they learned about the chains and planned to overcome them by having their ironclads ram the pontoons, causing them to sink and drag the chains down with them. The breakthrough was scheduled for February 19, 1868. The main problem was the limited coal supply on the monitors. To conserve fuel, the Brazilians decided to move in pairs, with the larger ships towing the smaller ones. Thus, Barroso towed Rio Grande, Bahia towed Alagoas, and Pará followed Tamandaré. On the night of February 19th, all three pairs, moving against the current, rounded a cape with a high hill and approached Humaitá. The Brazilians hoped that the Paraguayans would be asleep at night, but they were ready for battle, as the noise of the Brazilian steam engines was very loud, and sound carries far over the river. All 80 coastal guns opened fire on the ships, and the ironclads returned fire. Only 9 of their guns could fire ashore, but they had a quality advantage. The Paraguayan cannonballs, although they hit the Brazilian ships, bounced off their armor, while the elongated shells from the Whitworth rifled guns exploded, causing fires and destroying casemates. Nonetheless, the Paraguayan gunners managed to cut the tow rope connecting Bahia and Alagoas. The fire was so intense that the crew did not dare to come onto the deck, and as a result, the 5 ironclads moved ahead, while Alagoas drifted slowly back down the river, toward the point where the Brazilian squadron had begun their breakthrough towards the enemy's capital. The Paraguayan artillery soon noticed the ship adrift and concentrated their fire, hoping to at least destroy this vessel. But all their efforts were in vain. The Monitor's boats were smashed, its masts were knocked overboard, but its armor was not penetrated. They also could not jam its turret, and miraculously, the smokestack remained intact. Meanwhile, the squadron in front rammed and sank the pontoons with chains, thereby clearing their path. However, the fate of the Monitor Alagoas remained unknown, but no sailors were lost on any of the other ships. Meanwhile, the Monitor had been carried by the current beyond a bend in the river, where the Paraguayan guns could no longer reach it. It anchored, and its sailors began inspecting the vessel. They found more than 20 dents from cannonballs, but none had penetrated the hull or the turret. Seeing that the enemy artillery was powerless against his ship, the Monitor's commander ordered the steam to be raised and to proceed alone. Admittedly, it would take at least an hour to build up the pressure in the boilers, but this did not worry him, and why hurry, as morning had already begun. However, the Paraguayan forces were already waiting for the Monitor and decided to board it. They rushed to their boats, armed with sabers, boarding axes, and grappling hooks, and headed toward the slowly advancing enemy ship. The Brazilians noticed them and hurriedly secured the deck hatches, while about 12 sailors, led by the sole officer, the ship's commander, climbed onto the roof of the gun turret and began firing at the men in the boats with rifles and revolvers. The distance was short, and the oarsmen fell out one by one, shot dead or wounded, but 4 boats still managed to reach the Alagoas, and between 30 and 40 Paraguayan soldiers jumped onto its deck. Some tried to climb onto the turret, but were struck on the head with sabers and shot at point-blank range with revolvers. Others attempted to chop at the hatches and ventilation grills of the engine room with axes, but despite their efforts, made no progress. Finally, they realized that the Brazilians on the turret were about to shoot them one by one, and the surviving Paraguayans began jumping overboard. But then the Monitor increased speed, and several men were pulled under by the propellers. Seeing that their attempt to capture the Monitor had failed, the Paraguayan artillerymen fired a salvo that nearly sunk the ship. One of the heavy cannonballs hit the stern and knocked off an armor plate, already loosened by several previous hits. The wooden lining cracked, causing a leak, and water began flooding the hull. The crew rushed to the pumps, frantically bailing out water, and they continued until the ship, having traveled only a few kilometers, ran aground in an area controlled by Brazilian forces. Meanwhile, the squadron, having successfully broken through upstream, bypassed the Paraguayan Fort Timbo, whose guns did no damage, and by February 20th, had reached Asunción and bombarded the newly built presidential palace. In the city, this caused panic, as the government had repeatedly stated that no enemy ship would reach the country's capital. But then, fortune favored the Paraguayans because the squadron ran out of ammunition. There wasn't enough to destroy the palace, or even to sink the flagship of the Paraguayan fleet, the paddle frigate Paraguay, which was moored right there. On February 24th, the Brazilian ships once again passed Humaitá without losses, though the Paraguayan artillery managed to damage the armor belt of the ironclad Tamandaré. As they passed the immobilized Alagoas, the ships saluted it with their whistles. Later, the Paraguayans spent several months repairing the captured Alagoas, but by June 1868, it was participating in military operations, this time on the Paraguayan side. The situation worsened due to the defeat of the Paraguayan squadron on June 11, 1865, in the Battle of Riachuelo. From that moment, the Triple Alliance began to control the rivers of the La Plata Basin. Gradually, the balance of power began to take its toll, and by the end of 1865, Paraguayan forces were driven out of previously captured territories. The coalition assembled a 50,000-strong army and started preparing for an invasion of Paraguay. The invading army could not immediately break into the country, as they were held back by fortifications near the confluence of the Paraguay and Paraná rivers, where battles continued for more than 2 years. Thus, the fortress of Humaitá became Paraguay's own Sevastopol, delaying the enemy for 30 months. It only fell on July 25, 1868. After that, Paraguay was doomed. The invaders, supported by the international community, slowly and with great losses, simply pushed through the Paraguayan defenses, effectively grinding them down and paying a heavy price in terms of casualties. These losses were not only due to bullets, but also dysentery, cholera, and other hardships of the tropical climate. In a series of battles in December 1868, the remnants of Paraguay's troops were almost completely destroyed. Francisco Solano Lopez refused to surrender and retreated to the mountains. Asunción fell in January 1869. It's worth noting that the people of Paraguay defended their country almost entirely, with even women and children fighting. Lopez continued the war in the mountains northeast of Asunción, and people joined guerrilla units in the mountains. A year-long guerrilla war ensued, but eventually the remaining Paraguayan forces were defeated. On March 1, 1870, Solano Lopez's unit was surrounded and destroyed. The head of Paraguay heroically died with the words, "I die for my homeland," which once again underscores the heroism and patriotism of Paraguayan men. The Paraguayan people fought to the last, and even the enemies noted the widespread heroism of the population. Many women, some with lances and sticks, others with small children in their arms, furiously threw sand, stones, and bottles at the attackers. The parish priests of Paraguay and Valenzuela fought with rifles in their hands. Boys aged 8 to 10 lay dead with their weapons beside them, while other wounded children showed stoic calm, not uttering a single groan, noted Brazilian historian Rocha Pombo. Children also fought heroically in the war, and in Paraguay, there is even a memorial day for this that takes place on August 16th. The territory of Paraguay was reduced in favor of Argentina and Brazil. The Argentinians even proposed completely dismembering Paraguay and dividing it brotherly, but Rio de Janeiro disagreed. The Brazilians wanted to have a buffer between Argentina and Brazil. Britain and the banks behind it also benefited from the war. The main powers of Latin America, Argentina and Brazil, found themselves in financial dependency, having borrowed huge sums. The opportunities offered by the Paraguayan experiment were destroyed. Paraguay's industry was dismantled, with most Paraguayan villages being emptied and abandoned, as the remaining people relocated to the vicinity of Asunción. People turned to subsistence farming, and a significant portion of the land was acquired by foreigners, mainly Argentinians, becoming private estates. The country's market was open to British goods, and the new government took a foreign loan of £1 million for the first time. According to various estimates, Paraguay lost about 40% of its territory, but the loss of territory is overshadowed by the fact that, according to some estimates, Paraguay lost up to 90% of its male population in this war, leading to the countries being literally called the widow country. The economy was completely devastated, the infrastructure was destroyed, and the population was plunged into extreme poverty. The occupation of Asunción by Allied troops was accompanied by violence and destruction. Many settlements were wiped off the map, and the surviving inhabitants faced repression. This humanitarian catastrophe was condemned even beyond South America. Despite the heavy losses, Paraguay began the process of recovery. Women played a key role in the revival of the country, taking on many responsibilities in the restoration of the economy, production, infrastructure, politics, and society. Today, the memory of the Paraguayan War remains an important part of national identity, serving as a reminder of the tragic chapters in history and the resilience of the people. Many artistic works exist, with artists from all over the world dedicating their paintings to this event. This event clearly demonstrates that if a people are united in defending their homeland and idea, they can only be defeated with total genocide and destruction.